I have to say I'm sitting here with the pleasure of talking to a man who indulged with Hot Lips Page.
among others, yes. But lips, we've talked about lips.
Yeah.
Lips could inhale the whole thing. Trumpet players have good breath. Roy too, you know. So I was thinking almost everybody I knew well, you know who was very open about it at a time where that was not common, was Sweets. Sweets was a character. But Sweets had a recording session. It wasn't a big band, but maybe about a 7-piece band. And it was in the studio, you know, I mean, there weren't any visitors necessarily. But he just, in the break, he just took out a joint and lit up, you know, in front of everybody. Just like that. Very cool. If anybody wanted it, we passed it around. Passing was a thing, you know, there was a social thing associated with smoking, which is very similar to what's associated with drinking. You know, I mean, civilized drinking.
Yeah.
So smoking in a social setting was also civilized. You would share, you know, different stuff, like sampling different vintages of wine or something like that. Now, with all the stuff that they got now, you know, that God knows, you know, there wasn't that much of a variety then. But I told you the Dexter Gordon story, didn't I?
Tell it again for this context.
Yeah. Well, as you know, Dexter was in Louis' big band. It was one of his first important jobs. And you know how, you know, he told me how Louis hired him. You know, he was at it was a jam session and Louis happened to be there and Dexter was playing and he said somebody came up behind him and put his arms around his neck and said, the voice in his ear, "I want you in my band." And that was Louis. So he told me, Dexter told me that they would, you know, get high together. And as I said, you know, there are different samples, you know, you would smoke each other's, you know. And there was one time when Dexter had something that was really outstanding, and that was the first that they smoked. And then Dexter said, well, how about yours? Because Louis wasn't pulling anything out. And Louis said, man, he said, you don't bring a hamburger to a banquet. So, that's the quality. I just got, some new Dexter just came out in Europe. 3, including one double and 2 single CDs of Dexter in Europe. There's one in Denmark, there's one in Holland, there's one in Tokyo. Great stuff, great stuff. Dexter's awesome now.
Any other stories for indulgence that come to mind?
There must be. Well, some of them don't have to do with music.
That's okay.
No, they would be rather personal.
Okay.
Driving was an interesting thing. It varied because I'm a non-driver. I grew up in Europe during the war. No gas or anything, you know, I had no opportunity, although I wanted to. I was crazy about cars at a certain age. When I came here, it was New York. So New York, if I had come to some place in, you know, Indiana or Massachusetts or something, I would have learned to drive. But I didn't learn. And in the Army, I hoped that I would learn because you were supposed to. I was in the artillery. And you wasn't supposed to know how to drive. That was supposed to be, that was a regulation. In the infantry you didn't, but in the artillery you did. So I said to myself, hey, you know, one good thing about being in the Army would be that I would learn to drive finally. But unfortunately, I was in an artillery battalion with a battery, you know, battery A. I was the battery clerk, which means that I did all the paperwork, the morning report and all that. And so the first sergeant was a veteran with lots of stripes, master sergeant. He was American Indian, and he was a big guy, and he had all kinds of combat stripes and stuff. So I said, Sarge, I'm supposed to be able to drive and to some lessons. He said, listen, he said, I got 100 guys who know how to drive, but you know how to type. You're gonna stay right here. So that was my last chance. So anyway, driving, I had one friend who unfortunately passed away recently, Izzy, who was a great driver, and he loved to drive under the influence. He said it made him react more, again because of the time thing. And one time we were driving, there was a situation that could have become an accident with a motorcycle guy who did something stupid, and he did that perfectly. But there were other drivers who absolutely not. They did not want to drive whenever. So being under the influence is different for different people, and that naturally it's the same with people drinking. I mean, you got terrible drunks, can't tolerate anything, and you got guys who can drink a whole bottle or something and walk a straight line and speak clearly. So this is most risky was I had a roommate for a while at Brandeis who had a motorcycle, and I didn't really particularly like to ride on the back seat of a motorcycle, but he also indulged. And once there was a situation where I simply had to ride with him, and I was a bit nervous about that. But it worked out okay, obviously.
Yes, you're here.
I'm still here, yes. So it was, it was an interesting chapter, sort of a sideline thing, because you learned about the different quality stuff, and then people like Vic, who was a great roller, and others who preferred the pipe, and all these things, and it was a great socializer. Once you got to know people and they got to know you and you were fellow vipers, that was a binder, and it was really it's a socially binding thing, I think more so than booze, because booze gets you into a mental state that is not necessarily very clear, whereas indulging can get you very clear indeed. Can put you right on the mark. Now, if you want to, I can talk about something else, which is LSD.
Of course.
With which I did not volunteer, but when I was with Metronome, a sideline, the person who got me in the job at Metronome was Bob Perlongo, who was the associate editor. He was a poet and quite a good one, and later became editor of a literary magazine in Chicago. I don't know what happened to Bob. It's been decades since I saw him. But he was also a writer anyway. So what happened was the editor got fired because of a drinking problem that he had. I was associate editor. At that point in time, they didn't make me editor yet because I didn't have that much experience or so they hired a guy who is gone now, named Dave Solomon. And Dave Solomon didn't really have much experience either, certainly as a jazz editor. He had worked for Esquire, but at Esquire he didn't really have an editing position. He was doing something else. He knew quite a bit about jazz, not as much as he thought he knew, but he knew quite a bit. He played a little cornet, and he had a cornet that he kept on his desk, and he could play the first few bars of Bix's solo on Coming Virginia. And he played those few bars very nicely. But he was a bit of he was very gifted in certain ways, but he was also a bit of a nutcase, and very unpredictable in what he was liable to do. What he did with the magazine was fascinating because he knew a lot of people, like he knew Burroughs. We published before Naked Lunch, there was a chapter from that. He knew Kerouac and all these people, and cartoonists. We had some pretty wild stuff in that magazine, which really had nothing to do with jazz. He wanted to write, which was all right. It was interesting, but well, he was a pothead also, and well, this will come at the very end. But he got, and somebody put him in touch. He got to know Timothy Leary, and Leary at that time, he was of course one of the pioneers of LSD, and Leary engaged him in something that he was doing, which was to supervise people that he would pick, not Leary, but in this case Dave would pick as likely subjects, and keep a log of how they reacted, what they were doing, and so on and so forth. So Dave suggested to me that we do this. And at that point in time, I knew him well enough to feel that I could trust him insofar as, whatever might happen. So we did this, and it was a very strange experience. Not one that I wanted to repeat at all. I did not want to repeat it. It puts you into a state of mind that was far from real, far from real. It put you into another category mentally, and I didn't really want to be there. It made you. It wasn't at all unpleasant. It was just very strange. It started you thinking about, time in the way of, what is eternity? It made you think about, really strange things like that, including death, and it put you into a state of mind where you didn't want to be out in the open, crossing the street or anything like that. I didn't want to try it again. Later on, I had a friend at Brandeis. I mean, this was before then, but I still knew him, who was a biologist, and he said that it's, he was not the first one and the only one. He said it's not good for you to do that, So I only did it once. I had no desire to do it again, although people told me that if you do it again, it's going to be different. But that was enough for me.
All right. Let's close this off with my final line, which is Buster Bailey's "Light Up, Let's All Get Mellow."
Yes, mellow is a good word that you don't hear it much anymore.
No.
But that's really the thing about it. It does make you mellow. I will probably not do it again due to my advanced age, but I'm glad I did it. I had some wonderful times with it. And it opened up my ears. It really did.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.